Welcome to Keeping Track of a Rapidly Changing World on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called Venezuela Geopolitical Crisis. What is happening in Venezuela, and how will it affect Latin America and the world? Our co host for the show is Shackley Raffetto. Welcome to the show, Shackley.
Aloha, Jay. Nice to be here.
The fall of Maduro could result in the biggest changes in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in a century. But I think, and you think, we all think that it needs context. Can you give us context on what has happened?
What I did was I tried to research a little bit about Venezuela in general and then bring it down to what's going on now. And I remember when we talked a few weeks ago and I brought the subject of Venezuela up, nothing had happened yet. And so much has happened since then. It's sort of mind blowing. But anyway, like a lot of people, I didn't really have never really paid much attention to South America. I've been to Argentina once. I wasn't even sure where Venezuela was exactly or what countries were around it. So I had to look it up. And it actually is a pretty interesting country. It's a very large country. It's like the 35th largest country in the world. It's twice the land area of California. It's 35% larger than Texas. So it's a big country. And it has a lot of variety. For instance, it has the highest waterfall in South America, which is over 3,000 feet high, if you can imagine that. It has the Orinoco River Basin, which is the third largest river basin in the world, which provides all that. And so a lot of it's navigable too, so it allows transport from the interior. And the Lake Maracaibo is the largest lake in South America. It's more than 5,000 square miles in size, which is pretty incredible to think about. And under that is our huge resources in oil. And in fact, as you've heard on the news, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even larger than the Persian Gulf, which I didn't know. I mean, that's enormous, and that's one of the reasons why all these other countries, including the United States, are so interested in what's going on there. It has about a 1,700-mile coastline along both the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean, it's basically in a little closer to the equator than Hawaii. It goes from about 0 degrees on the equator up to about 15 degrees, I think. So in the lowlands, it's pretty warm, pretty tropical. Most of the population is urban, lives in the urban areas. It's most importantly, it's bordered on the western side by Colombia. And that's important, and we'll get back to that because Colombia is the world's largest producer of cocaine, and it was the drugs which kind of brought Venezuela to the attention of the international community so recently. The population of Venezuela is about 30 million people, but because of the financial and other crises that have gone on since the Chavez regime started, about 30% of the population is left, which has immigrated, and that's about 7 million people. Some to America, some to surrounding countries, but that's a huge number of people. The other thing that's interesting is it has the highest inflation rate in the world. Hyperinflation, I guess, is the way they describe it. Right now, $1 will buy you 350 bolivares, which is the name for their dollar. They anticipate that in 2026, the inflation rate will be 682%. And you can think about what that means for the poor people in Venezuela and why there's so much unrest. Now, Venezuela actually well, first off, it was first discovered by the West when Christopher Columbus on his third voyage landed there discovered it, quote unquote. There were lots of people there, of course, but they uncovered it. They saw the houses on stilts in the big lake, and they called it Venice, Venezuela, after Venice in Italy, which was
Mm.
interesting. And then later on, it became in about 1830, it became independent from Mexico or from Spain, that had colonized it. And Simon Bolivar, the famous South American military man, was responsible for that. And then over time in the 20th century, it developed a kind of democratic society and became pretty wealthy because they discovered these huge oil reserves, and those were developed mostly by companies from outside of Venezuela. And because of the potential for profits, they invested heavily in it, and so it was quite successful and resulted in a lot of income and uh, you know, wealth coming into the country. And so that improved the life of everyone, although there has always been a lot of elite corruption in Venezuela, even though they had a quote, democratic system, unquote. It wasn't fair all the way around, and there were lots of poor people. And then when Chavez came in 1999, he actually was a military officer who had tried to take over the country by a coup a few years before he actually got in, and he was in prison. And then when he got out, he was kind of well, he's a socialist. He became a socialist dictator, but he promised a lot of things to people, and because of the corruption and the dissatisfaction of people with the existing system, he was elected in 1999, and he ran the country pretty much with an iron hand until he passed away in 2013, and that's when President Maduro came in, the gentleman who the U.S. arrested and Delta Force took out of the country, and he's now sitting in a jail, and I guess in Florida, waiting to face some drug charges. And his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is running the country now. She was sworn in as his replacement. That's kind of a basic background. Now, Venezuela came on our screen recently because President Trump sent a carrier battle group and a whole lot of other resources, military resources, down into that area, and he started attacking alleged drug running boats from that were coming from Venezuela to bring drugs into the United States. Now, I mentioned Colombia before. Over time, the military people in Venezuela had been active near the Colombian border, and they began to make deals with the people who were producing the cocaine. And the way Colombia uh, promotes their cocaine industry is they grow it there, and apparently the coca plants require a certain kind of environment or climate, and Colombia has that, but then they have to distribute it. Excuse me. And so one of the distributors turned out to be Venezuela, and the senior military officers in Venezuela formed their own cartel called the Cartel of the Suns, and they use government resources, military resources, to transport the cocaine up to into America, and they were one of the major resources in order to carry that out, and that's why uh, the President Trump started blowing up those boats. Now, it is interesting. I looked this up on AI. Over the past 10 years, there have been 830,000 American overdose deaths, which is more than all of our war dead, including the Revolutionary War. So this strike, and I'm aware of it from having been a judge and a drug court judge. It's a horrible, terrible thing, and I thought it made some sense to go after the cartels, and that's a whole nother subject. I mean, there's cartels everywhere distributing all different kinds of drugs, including fentanyl and heroin and so on. And that might be another good subject to talk about. But anyway, the reason that the cartel of the Suns got started is because um, Venezuela nationalized the oil industry. And I remember seeing president of Chevron say that they had their all of their equipment and capital improvements taken away twice by the government, so they had lost all that. They basically, the Venezuelans basically, once they expropriated the oil industry, they ran it down, and it became more and more corrupt. And so the oil revenues decreased enormously, and they found this other source of income, the transportation of the drugs by the cartel of the Suns. And so both of those were going on. And in the meantime, so the battle group goes down there and begins to intervene, and then after they've blown up some of those boats and they've enforced the sanctions both on Iran and Venezuela and others, and started boarding and taking the shadow fleet tankers, that's being done under the guise of the sanctions that the U.S. has put on them, and I guess other international sanctions. And I was curious why they would pick up a tanker because of a violation of Iran's sanction. But apparently, what they do is they track these tankers, and if it was a tanker that had transported oil from Iran at some point, and just happened to be coming out of Venezuela with a load, uh, they figured it was a violation of that sanction, and so they justified picking up for based on the Iran sanction as well as the Venezuelan sanction. And as you know, they've boarded and taken about 7 tankers now, so it's quite a bit. And the idea there, of course, is to reduce the income that Venezuela gets from the oil, as well as these other sanctioned countries. Um, Now, all of these activities have had big repercussions for other countries, and that's where I think it becomes a geopolitical discussion. The countries that seem to be most affected are China, I would say, Russia, Iran, because of the sanctions I just mentioned, Cuba, which receives, I guess, discounted oil and a lot of support from Venezuela in exchange for military assistance and some other support that they get. So that then it raises the issue that you raised about, well, what about the Monroe Doctrine? Is this an extension of the Monroe Doctrine? And so I looked at the Monroe Doctrine, we all learn in school. And the Monroe Doctrine was announced by President Monroe, written by John Adams in 1823. And it was basically to prohibit any further colonization in the Western Hemisphere by the European nations. Um, Europe at that time was pretty busy with with Napoleon Bonaparte and his wars in Europe, and the idea was that we would recognize existing colonies of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, but we don't want any more. And then we agreed that we would not involve ourselves in the European wars, which echoes down to today, that sentiment. And there was a Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904 by Teddy Roosevelt, and he expanded it. He wanted it to cover what he called chronic wrongdoing. If he identified any chronic wrongdoing in a Latin American country, he expanded the doctrine to include military intervention in those countries. And he did militarily intervene in Cuba and Nicaragua and other places during that time. And basically what he would do is they would go in and they would take over the customs income of a country, and they would use that money to pay off debts that those countries owe to the Europeans in order to keep the Europeans from increasing their influence, kind of like what China is doing today. The Europeans were doing at that time. And that was the purpose of his expansion of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, when Frank Nolan, and then there was something called dollar diplomacy that was created. And that idea was that in addition to controlling customs income, we would he would cause American banks and companies to invest in these countries, and we would make sure that those investments are safe using our military um, forces where necessary. So we're basically making our own investment, keeping the Europeans out, uh, and making sure that our investments were okay with our military forces. And that all kind of came to an end when Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1934, he introduced what he called the good neighbor policy. We weren't going to be as aggressive as that anymore. And that had been the policy, I guess, up until the advent of the Donroe Doctrine, if you want to call it that. And the question now is, what does that mean? What is um, President Trump trying to accomplish here, and why? And we started out talking about, well, the drugs are an important thing, but nobody's talking about drugs anymore. They're only talking about oil, and the fact that Trump has extradited Maduro in a kind of effort to do a semi-regime change, but is smart enough, I guess, to realize that we learned some lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that regime change is not as easy as talking about it. And he's maybe taking a new approach. It sounds more like dollar diplomacy in a way, because he wants to control the oil incomes. And it's important to note that China receives 80% of Venezuelan oil production. So when we took over the oil production of Venezuela, that's a huge impact on China. China has invested up to around $100 billion in Venezuela, and has made Venezuela a major uh, point of contact and point of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And so it may be that was part of his reasoning, was to uh, do what he can to beat back China, and also to slow down the Belt and Road investments that China has promoted in the Western Hemisphere. About 23 Latin American countries of a total of about 33 are part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And that means that China has made substantial investments in those nations, beginning with rare earth and mineral investments in mining and so on. Apparently, are huge lithium deposits in countries in South America, and of course, that's a very important mineral for electric cars and batteries and so on. And China has made huge investments there, and then they've expanded those investments into things like 5G and electronics, and Huawei is well established in Latin American countries. And as I mentioned to you, China has even established a satellite tracking facility in Western Argentina, which is affiliated with the People's Liberation Army in China, and is probably engaged in some sort of intelligence activity as well. So the um, the presence of China is a lot bigger than most people think, and it's a lot more aggressive. We've heard about the Panama Canal and so on, and that the Secretary of State went down and tried to deal with that. But I didn't know the extent of these other inroads, and I have a feeling that that's what the Donroe Doctrine is about, and that's the beginning of an approach that will be used to try to blunt the influence of the Chinese in Latin America. It also affects the Russians. The Russians, of course, are kind of on their back foot these days, but they'd had a significant influence in Venezuela in terms of military support. Their long range bombers used to land there to show support for Venezuela, and there was a lot of news about that. You may have recalled that. Also, Cuba, with the intervention of the U.S. and the dependence of Cuba upon Venezuelan support, that puts Cuba in a very bad spot. Um, and I'm sure that's you know, on purpose. The only problem with things like this is that it's the poor people who really suffer. If we're going to squeeze the top until uh, uh, they make some concessions, it's the poor people that suffer first. And I don't know if there's another way to. If we had military there, they'd be suffering as well. So I don't know if there are really any answers. So that's kind of a basic uh, rundown on what I've been thinking about as far as this subject and based on current events. Any thoughts?
That's really valuable because we've seen the raw meat news about the fast boats and the blowing up the fast boats and the task force that went in and took Maduro and his wife. But we haven't had that context, and I really must say that the press hasn't, the media hasn't taken the time to go through this kind of context that you have. So thank you.
Venezuela is very, it's on that um, sort of right shoulder of South America. The distance between Venezuela and the Gulf Coast of the United States is about 2,000 miles, easy within easy missile range. If the Chinese were to establish missiles there, reminds you of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And we're very vulnerable there because about 50% of our exports, including petroleum and wheat and soy and things like that, go through the Gulf of America from the Gulf Coast to be exported. That's 50% is a lot, and also our a huge percentage of our, I think 90% of the refined fuels that we use in the United States are refined in refineries along the Gulf Coast. And a huge percentage of our export of oil products are refined on the Gulf Coast. So it's a very vulnerable location in America, and it would be very close to Venezuela in military terms.
Cuba. My understanding is that Cuba doesn't have natural resources that could supply electricity.
Mhm.
And I guess for one reason or another, it hasn't really heavily engaged in renewables, doesn't have oil. So what's happened is Venezuela has provided it with oil from, its resources, however dwindling they may be. And so the lights in Cuba are lit with oil from Venezuela. And so Trump has effectively terminated the shipment of oil. Those tankers you talked about, some of them were taking oil to Cuba.
Mhm.
They're not doing that anymore. And so Trump has terminated, oil and thus electrical energy to Cuba. This is going to have a profound effect on Cuba. Without oil, you can't run all those old cars they have in Cuba. You
Mhm.
can't you can't generate electricity. You can't run institutional, brick and mortar facilities like hospitals.
Mhm.
And it won't be long before Cuba, will be profoundly affected. It probably already is profoundly affected. Is this a good thing for the U.S.? Is this what we want? Is this consistent with the policy as you have described it?
One possibility is that a lot of Cubans will try to escape and come to Florida. We'll have another mass migration of poor people who can't make it given the circumstances. I'm sure he's going to use it as leverage,
Yeah.
and that's maybe as a part of this Don Roe doctrine, for Latin America. I guess that seems to be the direction it's going in for sure. Um, and also, the other Latin American countries are going to be looking at how Maduro, uh, you know, went on his vacation to Florida, and they're going to be thinking twice about their relationship with America and China and reassessing. And the other thing that's interesting is the response of China and Russia to this action has been pretty muted. They haven't been outraged, and you'd think China would be a little more outraged because they have huge investments in South America, and but it hasn't been the case. So
Um,
it's let me. One other thing I just point out is back when the U.S. was contemplating invading Iraq. General Zinni, who was, I think this is correct, he was the head of CENTCOM at the time, and he noted that there hadn't been much information given about how many troops were going to be necessary to occupy Iraq. And so he had his staff look into that based upon how many troops it took to occupy Germany and Japan and maybe South Korea. And he came up with a number of 500,000 troops. And he floated that, and of course nobody wanted to hear that, and he was relieved of his command shortly after that. He left early. I don't know if that was exactly the reason, but I wouldn't be surprised. But you think back now, that was probably exactly right. It would have taken at least 500,000 to actually control a country like we did Germany and Japan, and those countries did turn into viable democracies, but we're still there. We're still in both of those countries. And so that approach simply doesn't work. And this regime change idea is definitely passe. So I guess this new approach, we'll have to wait and see.
well, I think the Chinese are waiting to see. I think the world is waiting to see what
Mhm.
Trump does now. My understanding is he does not have troops. There were some troops on the ground. There were some people killed when the task force originally went to arrest Maduro, but I don't think they're there anymore. We don't have 500,000 for sure. We don't have any significant number. We may have nobody. And so this whole thing about, if not regime change, at least having a presence, having a real presence in Venezuela. My sense from the news is that there isn't a presence. Everybody's waiting to see whether we develop a presence. So, do you agree with that state of affairs? And isn't a presence important if you're trying to build a better society? I'm not sure that we are. Build a better society in Venezuela.
Looking at historical examples like Germany and Japan and the Zinni, General Zinni's hopeful idea, I don't see any I don't see how troops on the ground are going to work unless you have overwhelming force. I just don't think it works. And maybe dollar diplomacy will have some possibility. Substitute Western investment for the Chinese investment over time. Um, though the Chinese are able to, we have these. What is the law that prevents us from the foreign direct investment? No, there's a law that prevents American businesses from bribing people overseas, which doesn't apply to other countries. So we're sort of at a disadvantage there. Um, so I don't know the answer. It's going to be very interesting to see, but there's a lot at play here.
The jury's out, may I say. That's especially relevant for you. The jury hasn't told us which way this thing is going. So far, we have Rodriguez is still running the country. The woman who won the Nobel Prize for Peace gave it to Trump, which the Nobel Foundation said you can't do that. And the Nobel Prize is at issue. The management of the country is at issue. There's a certain amount of repression going on by the old administration. The Maduro administration under Rodriguez is still there. and it is opposing anybody who supports the U.S. So I don't know how much chaos that goes to, but it sounds like a pathway to chaos. So what is the Don Rowe doctrine ultimately, designed to do? If it's a matter of oil, there's a question in my mind anyway about what is Trump going to do with that oil? He seized a lot of oil. He's trying to get the American oil companies to come back in. They have been reluctant to do so. He's trying to sell this oil. It's not as marketable as sweet crude because it's sour crude. That's not as attractive. And he's put the proceeds, or he said he put the proceeds in the Gulf states, in Qatar, I think. Why Qatar? Why not? Why not one of the banks in New York? Why not some American institution instead of one in the Gulf? And so, the jury is out on so many things. And it's hard to say where this is going to go in terms of helping the US, helping Venezuela, helping other Latin American countries. My own view is if you're going to do this sort of thing, however legal or illegal it may be, you want to build up Latin America. You want to
Mhm.
do what James Monroe had in his mind in 1823. You want to have a friendly group of nations. You want to build up their economies. You want to make a civil society. I'm afraid the U.S. really hasn't done that. There's lots of history, and you have alluded to it, where we have really not done that. And so, what does the Monroe Doctrine intend to do, as we know it so far?
His negotiating style is such that he doesn't lay it out in a doctrinal way, or a strategic way, which is going to be a problem over time because we won't know where we're going, right? And one glimmer of hope I saw was um, President Milei, is that how you pronounce his name, in Argentina, who seems to be doing pretty well. He is making an effort, apparently, to gather some South American countries to start a new association of nations to promote a free market enterprise and so on, and move away from the socialist dictatorship model that has dominated a lot of the Latin American countries. Now, maybe there's a glimmer of light if he doesn't get assassinated or something crazy happen. Um, but that's a long way off. But that would be the direction, we'd like to see South America go in. Uh, but I don't know. We're just kind of in a holding pattern, sort of
Yeah.
waiting day by day to see which tankers next, and who's going to get what kind of deal is going to be made with China to buy Venezuelan oil. Do they get any oil or not, and under what circumstances? And it seems to be going on a day by day basis, which is um, I don't think it's helpful to the president and his administration. I'd like to see Marco Rubio down there talking to people and explaining things. He's pretty good at that.
The Argentinian group was, among other things, an effort to avoid this sort of attack from happening again. I don't know exactly what Trump has said, pro or con the Argentinian group, but it sounds to me like a valuable idea. There should be a pan Latin American, a pan American group that emerges out of all this. That would be positive. But I
Yeah.
don't I don't see that. I don't see the United States as really incentivizing that. So when we say that the jury's out on this, it's out on bloody everything, and
Mhm.
he's waiting, we're waiting. All the countries of Latin America are waiting to see what happens. But I'll go a step further. The world order is waiting to see what happens.
Mhm.
They're shocked by the shocking nature of this attack, but they really haven't galvanized a response except to be shocked. So my question is, what are the underpinnings of all of this? Is whether and to the extent is that this attack was legal, and whether the shooting of the fast boats was legal, the taking of the oil tankers was legal under international law, under the world order as it has existed, or is it changing the notion of fast boats, of drug interdiction, if you will, of drug production and distribution. Has it had an effect on these things, or are we waiting on that too? What does Putin think? What does Europe think about this? It all seems very disruptive internationally.
Well, the Europeans have got their hands full, of course, at the moment.
Yes, they do.
And yeah, the big player is China, obviously. Um, so I don't have any reasonable thoughts on it actually as to what will happen. I just kind of wait and see. Uh, the legality of the blowing up the boats. I don't know. People, the big countries don't seem to follow international law. They only follow it when it's to their convenience. China didn't follow it when they lost the international court decision about the islands in the South China Sea. They just ignored it, and Russia has ignored it. Russia's is doing forced adoptions of Ukrainian children and crazy things like all clear war crimes, and nobody's paying attention. And then and us, President Obama murdered a United States citizen, um, you know, with a drone strike, who he didn't like. So I'm worried about. I know we hope in the West that we could proceed by the international rules based order, but it's looking pretty ragged right now.
We know that there are many interests, including Marco Rubio's experience in Cuba and how he doesn't like the communist regime there. And so he would be one voice in the White House that argues for going after Cuba and uh, ultimately maybe making a deal or changing regime or finding a way to dominate them. But my question to you is, looking at it right now, today, what kind of foreign policy should we have? You've mentioned all kinds of foreign policies over these last, 200 years
Mhm.
since the Monroe Doctrine. Um, what should be the Monroe document is undefined. I will agree. But what should it be? What should United States policy be? It seems to me that we could build Latin America, not only dominated country by country,
Mhm.
and aside from Canada and Greenland and all those issues, but we could build a better hemisphere. And I don't think this attack did that or is likely to do that. But if we were to take another look at the Monroe Doctrine and update it all the way through all those doctrines you talked about to a kind of better defined Donroe Doctrine, what would that look like? What should our foreign policy be for this hemisphere, for Latin America? What would be the best way to make this hemisphere robust and prosperous and caring and decent to its citizens?
Support President Millet's efforts to gather a group of uh, market-based economy acolytes and to try to build there, support that with whatever it takes, finances, expertise, educational opportunities, all of that. We have to do something to fight the cartels because they're um, transporting these terrible drugs like fentanyl with the cooperation of China in that case. That's got to be stopped somehow for the reasons of health, for primarily, but also enormous amounts of illegal funds are being introduced into the international, economic system. And I heard someplace that if that a lot of that money gets laundered in London, in the financial houses there, and so they have an incentive not to do anything about it, and that needs to be looked into. What happens with all those illegal funds and it's billions of dollars a year. That can't be helping South America. That has to be drawn to a stop. But the South Americans, I mean, we can help, but ultimately they have to solve those problems.
Do you agree that we need to help? We must help. Because
Yes.
one of the things that I've been thinking about really for many years is the immigration problem at the border. These
Mm,
people are trying to cross the border, or successfully or otherwise crossing the border, because they can't stand it. They can't stand the gangs, the cartels. They can't stand, the repression in so many countries, the lack of any kind of democratic government. They got to get out of it. They got to get out of where they are.
mhm,
And it's, in many ways, Latin America is a failed continent or subcontinent. The U.S. has every interest in the world to make it to make it better. And
mm.
it's not just a matter of building a wall or stopping immigration or putting a pox on all their houses. Don't you agree that this may be an opportunity when the US, which is so prosperous and powerful, could step in with its foreign policy in this hemisphere? Forget about other hemispheres, forget about the rest of the world. Let's be isolationists for a minute, just for a minute. Wouldn't it be good for us to have a policy that would make Latin America a better place? I mean, a kinder, gentler place, a place with a certain degree of representative government and prosperity and the fair and equitable distribution of natural resources, instead of taking it country by country, immigrant by immigrant, and attacking it. I know that's a hard road to hoe, but
Mhm.
ideally, wouldn't that be a better thing to do than what we're doing now?
I think it's probably should be our most important goal, um, at, for the foreseeable future. I can't think of anything that's more important. And the infiltration of China into all these nations just puts an exclamation point on that. We don't do something soon that's effective, it's going to get a lot worse, real fast. And we have an opportunity to perhaps guide the change and support it. And we should be that's what we should be doing. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, we're pretty much out of time, Shackley. This has been a great and very educational discussion. I have learned so much here, and really appreciate your research and coming on discussing it. I want to offer you the opportunity to make any final statement you care to make about what people should be thinking about, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a question in my mind, at least, about whether the media has properly educated us. They've given raw meat news, which they are always inclined to do, but
Mhm.
they haven't given us the context that you have. So what message would you leave with people about these issues, about these problems?
I guess the message is that the problems are a lot greater than most people think. Typically, Americans know nothing about South America unless they have a relative there, and that's the present state of things. But things are changing rapidly in South America, and not necessarily to, you know, for our benefit, or for the benefit of the South American people in the long run. And we need to take action to to change that and to try to assist them in their evolution, towards better societies.
Yeah, and the magic word is change, because whatever we know, whatever we found in our incursion into Venezuela, it's changing, and maybe that incursion makes it change faster. So we have to get a handle on that, and we have to try to make that change work as best it possibly can.
Our government needs to articulate the strategy, which they haven't done.
Yeah. Well, we have these shows; we can help them. No.
Yes, I'm happy to help.
Thanks so much to our co-host Shackley Raffetto. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping Track of a Rapidly Changing World, the emphasis on rapidly changing. In this episode, we have discussed Venezuela, a geopolitical crisis. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Shackley.
Aloha.